In the year 1821, on the banks of the Mississippi in Louisiana, the Bellamy Plantation rose from soil both rich and cursed. Its white columns gleamed against the dark waters, a symbol of wealth built on cotton, cane, and silence. But beneath the grandeur lingered whispers older than the house itself. Locals spoke of a pact, sealed in blood, that bound every Bellamy daughter to the river's will. One by one, the young women vanished, their lives taken by currents that showed no mercy. Some called it accident, others called it tradition. But the truth was far more sinister. The Mississippi was not just a river, it was a covenant, and the Bellamys had fed it for generations. This is the story of Clara Bellamy, the daughter who dared to resist, and of a family consumed by the bargains of its patriarch. It is a tale of silence and defiance, of loss and freedom, and of a river that never forgets. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. The Mississippi River does not speak in words, yet its voice is everywhere. It murmurs through the hanging veils of Spanish moss. It sighs beneath the cypress roots that twist like knotted hands. It growls in the black depths where the current pulls against the shore. Those who have lived their lives along its banks know the sound well, and they say the river has a memory. They say it never forgets a promise once made. The Bellamy Plantation rose from this landscape in the year 1821, its white columns gleaming against a backdrop of swampland and fertile fields. To the stranger, the house looked like triumph, a testament to the will of Judge Silas Bellamy, who carved wealth from cotton and cane. To the locals, however, it was more than a mansion. It was a marker of debt, a debt that was never paid with coin, but with blood. For generations, the story had been whispered in hushed tones over tavern tables and across river barges. The Bellamy name carried power, but also a curse. Long ago, the family made a bargain when their land was still half drowned in mud and flood. Each daughter born into the Bellamy line was promised to the river. Not all at once, not in ceremony, but one by one, as time demanded. The pact was said to keep the waters from swallowing the plantation whole. It was said to keep the house standing when others washed away. No written record survived, no contract to be held up in proof. Only the river itself carried the testimony. And so, when a Bellamy girl wandered too near the water's edge and never returned, the town did not cry out in outrage. They shook their heads and muttered that the river had claimed its due. On humid nights, when the air itself seemed heavy with foreboding, the slaves in the quarters sang low songs of warning. They said you could hear the river call the names of the daughters in the dark. Some claimed to see pale figures drifting on the current, faces familiar, hair trailing like water lilies. The Bellamys, of course, never spoke of it. Inside the grand house, Judge Silas forbade the word curse from ever being uttered. To him, the river was nothing more than a force of nature, dangerous yet manageable, so long as its appetite was met. His daughters, however, learned to listen. They would pause in their play when the water whispered, staring toward the bank with wide, unblinking eyes. Even in the laughter of youth, they seemed to understand something their father would not admit. The Mississippi was watching, and it was waiting. Every Bellamy daughter knew, from her first breath to her last, that one day she would be called to the water. Some went willingly, others fought, but in the end, the river always claimed its prize. The Bellamy Plantation stood like a monument against the shifting soil of Louisiana, a house too proud for the land it occupied. Its white columns gleamed in the sun, polished smooth like the teeth of a predator. From a distance it looked eternal, as if it had always been there, a crown upon the river's brow. Yet those who lived in its shadow knew better. The land it claimed was stolen, the foundation resting on graves that had no markers, only memory. Before Judge Silas Bellamy laid his claim, this stretch of earth belonged to others. The river tribes fished here, their canoes gliding silently across the black water, their stories woven into the reeds. The French settlers marked it as theirs after blood and smoke. And then, in time, it was seized again, parceled off to men like Silas, who built fortunes not with his own hands, but with the labor of those he chained. Every brick, every beam, Every acre of cane rising from the soil carried the sweat of enslaved bodies, pressed into service until bone and spirit broke. The river saw it all. It watched as fields flooded and drained, season after season, soaking up the cries of the living and the silence of the dead. It watched as Silas Bellamy grew wealthy in courts by day and ruthless in the fields by night. To him, the plantation was proof of victory, a fortress against chaos, a throne from which his name would echo through generations. To the river, it was a house balanced on borrowed time. Neighbors called the plantation indestructible, marveling at how floods swept away fences and cabins but never touched the Bellamy home. When storms raged and levees cracked, the water always curved aside, sparing the grand estate as though in reverence. Some whispered it was not reverence at all, but recognition. The house stood because it was already paid for, paid not in coin, but in daughters, surrendered to the current when the river's hunger stirred. Inside those gleaming walls, life pretended at refinement. Silas's daughters learned to play the piano, their soft hands striking ivory keys while their father's cane fields filled with screams. They wore gowns of muslin and lace, but the hem of every dress seemed haunted by mud. Servants polished silver until it gleamed, though each reflection bent strangely, as if warped by unseen water. The plantation was not just a house, it was a bargain carved into timber and stone, a bargain upheld by fear. Even as laughter echoed from the grand hall, even as the judge toasted his victories, the river's presence pressed in from every window. It was patient, it was ancient, and it was waiting to collect what was promised. The Bellamy daughters grew up surrounded by beauty that never felt like their own. The plantation's gardens bloomed with magnolia trees, their wide white flowers unfolding each spring with a sweetness so heavy it seemed to cling to the air. Lace curtains swayed in the open windows of the great house, softening the sunlight that fell across polished floors. To the casual eye, theirs was a childhood painted in gentility, a picture of southern grace framed against the grand columns of their father's estate. But beauty was only a mask. Beneath the scent of magnolia lingered the sharp bite of the river, a smell of damp earth and slow decay that no fragrance could cover. And the Bellamy girls, no matter how finely dressed, no matter how carefully trained to curtsy and smile, could never ignore the whispering presence of the Mississippi. Their games always ended by its edge. Their laughter would fade into silence as they reached the bank, their small hands tightening around each other's, their eyes wide as they gazed into the moving water. There, at the river, they seemed to remember something their mother never spoke aloud. They would toss stones into the current and watch them disappear, each splash sounding like a warning. Sometimes they braided flower crowns, only to set them afloat, following the blossoms with solemn faces as though they carried more than petals, they carried futures. The river took everything, and the girls knew it would take them too. In the evenings, their play ended beneath the magnolias, where the blossoms dropped like pale shrouds onto the grass. The children gathered them in silence, laying them side by side in little rows, as if rehearsing funerals they would one day know too well. No adult told them to do this. It was instinct, born of a household where mourning was as constant as music. Their mother, Eleanor Bellamy, tried to shield them with lullabies and fine embroidery, but her eyes betrayed her grief. She had watched too many daughters disappear before them. When she brushed her children's hair, her hands trembled as though each strand might be the last she would touch. And when she stood by the windows, gazing out toward the river, she would whisper prayers too soft to be heard, her lips moving with desperate rhythm. The daughters carried that weight without words. They grew up beneath magnolia blossoms, trained to smile and curtsy, yet always aware that the river was watching. Their laughter never lasted long, their innocence always cut short by the sound of water moving beyond the trees. Childhood, for the Bellamy girls, was not a promise of life, but a preparation for loss. The magnolias bloomed, the lace curtains swayed, and in every corner of their days lingered the shadow of mourning. The town of Street Landry carried stories the way the river carried silt, heavy and unshakable, drifting from one generation to the next. In the taverns and at the marketplace, whispers moved like smoke, impossible to hold yet impossible to ignore. The Bellamys were not merely rich planters, the people said. Their fortune was too secure, their house too untouchable, their fields too strangely spared when floods ravaged the land. No family could build such power with cotton and cane alone. There had to be something more. Something darker. It was said the Bellamys had once stood at the edge of ruin, their first estate battered by storm and flood, their crops withered, their livestock drowned. Judge Silas's grandfather, desperate to hold on to the land, made his way to the river in the dead of night. Some claimed he carried a blade, others swore he carried his own newborn daughter. Whatever truth lies buried in that night, the story agreed on one point. A pact was struck, and blood was spilled. The river, hungry and listening, accepted the offering. And from that day forward, the Bellamys prospered. Neighbors told the tale with unease, lowering their voices as though the water itself might be listening. They pointed to the pattern. Each generation of Bellamy daughters reduced by tragedy. One girl drowned in a summer storm, another vanished while fetching water, another found lifeless beneath the reeds. Always the story ended the same: the river took them, and the plantation stood unharmed. The Bellamys themselves denied it, of course. Judge Silas laughed at such talk, dismissing it as superstition born from envy. Yet his laughter never reached his eyes, and his neighbors noticed how he stiffened whenever a daughter strayed too close to the riverbank. His wife Eleanor never spoke of it, but she lit candles long after midnight, praying not to heaven but to something else, her hands trembling as she shielded the flames from the wind. The enslaved families in the quarters did not doubt the story. They had seen Silas walk down to the water's edge in the darkest hours, his shoes sinking into the mud, his head bowed as though in prayer. They had heard the river's voice rise in answer, a deep murmur that seemed almost human. Among themselves they repeated the old saying, "The Bellamys did not own the land, the river owned the Bellamys." And so the pact lingered in memory, never written but always spoken. The Bellamys rose higher with each passing year, yet everyone knew their fortune was not secured by man or law. It was secured by a river that did not forget. Elise Bellamy was 14 years old when the river came for her. The morning was heavy with mist, the kind that clung to the cane fields and blurred the line between earth and water. She had slipped away from the house with a basket in hand, sent to gather wild herbs along the bank. It was a simple task, one she had done countless times before. But that morning, the river was waiting. When the basket was found later, overturned among the reeds, the family said she had wandered too close to the current. They said her foot must have slipped, her body pulled under before she had the chance to cry out. The search lasted hours. Men dragged the waters with ropes and poles, while Eleanor Bellamy wept silently behind lace curtains. Judge Silas stood at the shore, his jaw set, his eyes fixed not on the river but on the men who dared suggest the body might never be found. By evening, the search was abandoned. Elise had vanished without a trace. The plantation spoke of tragedy. The family called it misfortune, a cruel twist of nature that no man could prevent. But in town, the whispers began again. 14 years old, they murmured. The first daughter grown to womanhood. The first to be claimed. Neighbors shook their heads, their voices dropping to hushed tones. It was not misfortune, they said. It was the pact. The Bellamys did not hold a funeral, not truly. There was no body to bury, no coffin to lower into the earth. Instead, a service was conducted in the chapel, the pews filled with solemn faces and stiff silence. A portrait of Elise, her dark eyes staring wide and unblinking, was placed on the altar. Hymns were sung, prayers offered, but even within the holy walls the air felt damp, as though the river itself had seeped inside to listen. Afterward, Eleanor placed Elise's gown in the cedar chest where the daughter's clothes were kept. The muslin still smelled faintly of lavender, a cruel reminder of the girl who had worn it only days before. At night, the house grew heavy with grief, but Judge Silas forbade his family to speak of curses or pacts. He ordered his daughters to continue their studies, to play their music, to carry on as though Elise had never existed. His silence was final, his word law. But silence could not erase the truth. The enslaved families whispered of seeing Elise's reflection on the water, her hair streaming like weeds, her lips moving as though caught in endless prayer. Children in town avoided the river's edge, afraid they too might be pulled beneath. And so the story settled deep into memory. The first daughter lost, gone without a trace, taken not by chance but by tradition. The river had spoken, and its hunger was only beginning. Judge Silas Bellamy was a man of stature, a figure whose presence commanded respect in both the courthouse and the grand halls of his plantation. By day he wore the black robes of justice, his gavel striking down with authority as he pronounced verdicts that shaped the lives of men. In town he was seen as a pillar of order, a man whose words carried the weight of law itself. He smiled often, a wide and polished expression that reassured juries, soothed neighbors, and charmed politicians. But those who looked long enough at that smile saw something else behind it, a shadow that lingered in the corners of his eyes. In the evenings, when the court was closed and the town quiet, Silas returned to his true dominion. He presided not over juries or lawyers, but over his own household. His daughters sat beneath his gaze, their hands folded, their voices soft, their every movement measured against his expectations. To the outside world, they were the very picture of refinement, young women raised in order and grace. Yet within the house they lived beneath the constant weight of his authority, each smile of his like a blade disguised as kindness. The judge demanded perfection. Their dresses must be spotless, their posture flawless, their music without error. When they faltered, his smile remained, but it hardened, stretching across his face like a mask that concealed the severity beneath. It was said that nothing unsettled the Bellamy daughters more than their father's approval, for it carried with it the promise of something they could not name, a silent warning that the river itself seemed to echo. Silas was never seen mourning the loss of Elise. While his wife Eleanor withdrew into grief, pale and trembling, Silas walked through the town with his smile intact, as though nothing had been taken from him. He dismissed condolences with a firm nod, brushing aside whispers of tragedy as though they were beneath him. Yet on certain nights, when the moon hung over the Mississippi and the waters moved with restless hunger, Silas was seen walking alone toward the riverbank. Lantern in hand, his black coat drawn tight, he would stand for hours staring into the current. If he spoke, no one dared to come close enough to hear. The people of Street Landry began to say the judge had two faces, one for the courtroom, one for his home, and perhaps a third, reserved only for the river. His smile could sway juries and calm suspicion, but it could not deceive the water that had known his family's bargains for generations. Beneath the polished charm and the glint of his teeth, the river knew the truth. Judge Silas Bellamy was not a man of justice. He was a man of debt, and debts to the river were never forgiven. In the Bellamy household, the sewing never ceased. Eleanor Bellamy's hands, though frail with grief, worked tirelessly with needle and thread, guiding her daughters through endless lessons of embroidery and stitching. Bolts of white muslin were brought into the house season after season, and from them gowns were fashioned for the girls. At first glance, the dresses resembled those worn by brides, flowing and delicate, trimmed with lace and ribbons. To an outsider, they might have seemed to signal preparation for future marriages, symbols of new beginnings. But within the family, no such illusions lingered. For the Bellamy daughters, the gowns were not made for weddings. No suitors called upon them. No banns were read. Instead, the gowns were prepared for something unspoken yet understood, as though each stitch carried the weight of an old agreement. They were garments, not of union, but of surrender. The girls wore them during recitals, standing stiffly before their father as their fingers moved across the ivory keys of the piano. They wore them at dinners when guests visited, the pale fabric glowing under candlelight like shrouds. And always the gowns were tucked away again afterward, pressed into cedar chests that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Each dress waited, silent, until the river called for its wearer. The neighbors whispered when they saw the girls in those pale gowns, their faces half hidden behind the lace of the windows. Some said the Bellamy daughters looked like brides abandoned at the altar. Others muttered that they looked more like corpses laid out before burial. In either case, the sight unsettled them, and few stayed long at the Bellamy estate. The enslaved women who tended the girls knew the truth more than anyone. They washed the gowns when mud stained the hems, they mended the seams when tears appeared, and they sang soft laments as their fingers worked. To them, the dresses were not symbols of purity but omens, fabric destined to trail in the water before the year was done. They called them gowns for ghosts, and the name clung to the muslin like a curse. The daughters themselves rarely spoke of it, but when the gowns were lifted from the chest and fitted to their bodies, a hush always fell over them. They looked at one another with wide eyes, knowing each garment was less a piece of clothing than a prophecy. White as magnolia petals, delicate as breath, they were made not for brides, but for the river's bridesmaids, for daughters who would never return. Old Caleb had worked the Bellamy land longer than most could remember. His back was bent from years beneath the sun, his skin lined deep with age and labor, his voice cracked like dry timber. To the Bellamy family, he was nothing more than a servant bound to duty, but to the people of the quarters and the fields, Caleb was something else. He was a keeper of memory, a witness to secrets too dark to vanish with time. It was Caleb who first began to speak of Judge Silas's midnight walks. In whispers passed from ear to ear, he told of lantern light drifting across the fields when the house was dark and silent. He spoke of following at a distance, quiet as the wind, until the glow led him to the riverbank. There, beneath the arching shadows of cypress and oak, he had seen the judge kneel, the great man who wore black robes in the courtroom, who carried himself like law incarnate, bent his head before the restless current. Caleb swore he had heard Silas speaking not to himself, not to God, but to the river. The words were too low to carry fully, yet one sound repeated, again and again. Names. The judge whispered the names of his daughters, as though reciting a litany, as though reminding the water of the promises it was owed. Sometimes Caleb said the river seemed to answer, its surface rippling though no wind stirred, its murmur swelling until it sounded almost like speech. When Caleb shared these tales, some dismissed them as the ramblings of an old man too steeped in superstition. But others listened with solemn silence. They had seen enough to know the river's hunger was real. They had watched daughters vanish, watched gowns return damp and empty, watched the Bellamy fortune grow even as grief hollowed the household. Caleb's story was not madness. It was explanation. In the quarters, mothers clutched their children tighter when the moon was full. Field hands crossed themselves when the lantern light flickered beyond the cane rows. And every retelling of Caleb's words seemed to draw the truth tighter around the Bellamys like a noose. Still, Caleb did not stop speaking. His voice was thin but steady. His warnings carried in the hush of night when only the crickets listened. He said the judge's smile was for the town, but his prayers were for the river. And he said one night soon, the names whispered into the current would not belong to children yet to be born. They would belong to the man himself, for the river, Caleb warned, always collects its debts. Their resolve. The morning Margaret Bellamy was found, the air over the plantation was heavy, as though the sky itself carried grief before anyone else knew it was coming. She was only 16, her hair a pale shade that caught the sun like spun gold. But when they found her, there was no light left in her. She lay face down in the reeds by the riverbank, her dress tangled with mud and moss, her wrists bound neatly with satin ribbon, the color of morning white. The town whispered quickly. Elise, the first daughter, could be called an accident. Children wandered too close to the current, the water was swift, and tragedy came easily. But Margaret was different. Ribbons did not tie themselves. Girls did not walk willingly into the reeds at dawn with their hands bound. To some, it was proof of something darker than misfortune. To others, it was only the river claiming what it had been promised. The Bellamy household did not wail, did not collapse into public grief. Judge Silas stood in his black coat at the funeral, his mouth set in a line so thin it looked carved from stone. His wife, pale and quiet, held a handkerchief to her lips, but shed no tears. The sisters wore lace and white gloves, their faces veiled. No sobs echoed through the church, no trembling voices broke the hymns. It was as if they had rehearsed for this moment, as if mourning had become a ritual as familiar as supper. Those who watched whispered of fear, not sorrow. They wondered if the family dared not cry because tears would be wasted on something inevitable. Or perhaps tears were dangerous, for if the river watched, it might see grief as weakness and hunger for more. Margaret's coffin was carried past the magnolia trees, lowered into earth that was damp from the river's breath. The preacher spoke of God's will, but more than one in the crowd glanced toward the water beyond the fields, knowing the sermon was false. This was not heaven's taking. This was the pact, remembered in flesh. In the quarters, the workers said quietly that Margaret had not gone alone. Some swore they had seen lantern light in the night, moving toward the water. Others said they heard voices, low and urgent, before the splash. Old Caleb muttered that the ribbons were not tied by the girl's hands, and his words settled like stones in the minds of those who listened. And so the tale spread further, carried by whispers and shivers. The second daughter had been given, not taken. And with each life laid at the river's edge, the Bellamy's silence became the loudest confession of all. On the second floor of the Bellamy mansion, beyond a narrow hallway draped in velvet and shadows, there was a door that rarely opened. It was called the quiet room, though no laughter, no voices, no life had ever filled it. The key never left Judge Silas's pocket, and only the family knew what waited within. Servants spoke of it in hushed tones, saying that once a door is made to guard sorrow, it cannot be closed against it. Behind that locked door hung portraits, one for every daughter the river had taken. Elise with her bright girlish smile frozen forever, Margaret with her hair brushed into perfection, her ribbon painted in white across her wrist. Each canvas was framed in gold, but the air around them was heavy and cold, as though gilded wood could not disguise grief. The painters had captured delicate features, but in their eyes was something else, something that unsettled even the most faithful. When one stood in that room, it seemed as if all those painted eyes turned, not toward the visitor, but toward the tall windows that overlooked the Mississippi. The Bellamys rarely entered, but when they did, it was in silence. No prayers were spoken there, no music carried through its walls. It was a place meant not for remembrance, but for appeasement. Some whispered that Judge Silas ordered the portraits not out of love but out of duty, as though the river required not only flesh but memory. To forget a daughter might be seen as breaking the pact, and so their faces remained, watching, waiting. The sisters who remained alive feared the room most of all. Late at night they claimed to hear footsteps within, though the door was locked, or the faint brushing of skirts along the floor. Once, a maid swore she heard humming, the melody like a lullaby carried from the other side. She left her post before dawn and never returned. Old Caleb, who had seen more than he was meant to, told others that the quiet room was no mere gallery, it was a ledger. Each portrait was proof of a debt paid, each frame a tally mark of what the Bellamys owed the river, and he warned that as long as daughters remained, new canvases would be added. And so the room stayed sealed, a shrine of painted ghosts. Every time a storm swelled the river or the air grew heavy with the smell of rain, the family glanced upward to that silent door, knowing it waited to open again. For in the Bellamy mansion, the dead were never gone. They simply watched from their frames, their eyes fixed on the water that had claimed them. Father Duval arrived from New Orleans in the heat of midsummer, a young priest with sharp eyes and a voice that carried like thunder from the pulpit. The townsfolk had sent for him, hoping holy water and prayer might cleanse what whispers called cursed. For too long the river had taken the Bellamy daughters, and for too long the family had met each loss with silence. Some believed only the church could break whatever bond tied the house to the water. When Father Duval first stepped onto the plantation grounds, he paused beneath the columns and closed his eyes. He said later that the air itself felt wrong, heavy with a sweetness that rotted as it touched the tongue. Inside, the grand hall smelled faintly of lilies, though no flowers stood in their vases. It was not the perfume of blossoms, but the ghost of funerals past, clinging to plaster and wood. Judge Silas welcomed him with a smile too wide, his words polite, his gestures smooth. He asked the priest to walk the halls, to sprinkle water, to speak words of protection over his family. But as Duval moved from room to room, his face grew pale. When he entered the quiet room, where the portraits hung, he stopped at once. He would not step fully inside. He stood only at the threshold, clutching his crucifix, saying the air smelled of baptism gone wrong, as though holy water had been poured but no soul had been saved. The Bellamy women watched from the staircase, their white gowns glimmering faintly in the dim light. None spoke. Their silence pressed on the priest's chest heavier than any sermon he had given. When he asked to see the river, Silas led him there with measured steps. They stopped at the bank, where reeds swayed and the current whispered its endless song. Father Duval shook his head. He said no prayer could bind what had been bound in blood. He told Silas that no blessing could erase a covenant, sealed not with God but with the river itself. His words carried no fear, only certainty. He placed the crucifix back beneath his robes, turned away, and refused the supper offered to him. Before the sun dipped behind the cypress trees, the priest departed, leaving the Bellamy estate untouched. The townsfolk asked what he had seen, and he answered only this, that some houses are not homes, but altars, and altars demand sacrifice. That night, as darkness thickened along the river, the Bellamy mansion stood silent. No prayers echoed through its halls. The river moved on, patient and waiting, and Father Duval never returned. The summer rains came hard, heavy, and without pause. For days the sky cracked open, pouring down upon Louisiana as though the heavens themselves had split. The Mississippi swelled, thick and violent, its brown waters rising against the banks, pulling trees and cattle into its hungry current. The cane fields bent low, their stalks drowning in the rush, and the earth turned to black muck beneath every step. The people in town spoke of judgment, of nature's wrath, of a season meant to humble even the proudest of men. Houses near the river lost their walls, barns collapsed into the water, and families clung to rooftops as their fields dissolved. Yet when the flood reached the Bellamy Plantation, it paused. The current tore through the edges of their land, sweeping aside fences, flattening crops. But when it came upon the great house itself, the water curved. It parted around the columns, circling like a beast refusing to strike, leaving the mansion untouched. Neighbors who rode past on boats could not believe what they saw. All around, destruction reigned, but the Bellamy home stood tall, its windows glowing faintly with candlelight. One man swore he heard music from within, a piano playing as though nothing outside mattered. The water lapped at the steps but never climbed them, as if the river bowed before its own covenant. Whispers spread quickly. The Bellamys had already given their offering, and so the flood spared them. Margaret's ribbons, Elise's vanished body, the painted faces in the quiet room, all had been taken as payment. And now the river feasted elsewhere. The townsfolk shook their heads, their fear hardened into resentment. For while they buried their dead livestock, while they salvaged sodden belongings from broken homes, the Bellamys dined beneath chandeliers, safe and dry. Old Caleb watched from the quarters, his face grim. He said the river was no wild force of nature, not here. It chose. It remembered. It spared the house because the house had fed it. And he warned that what was spared once might not always be spared again. A debt rolled like water, it came back around. When the flood at last receded, it left behind ruin across the parish. But on Bellamy land, the house stood bright against the washed-out horizon, a gleaming island in a sea of wreckage. Some called it proof of the family's power, others called it proof of their curse. And as the mud dried and the cane fields lay flat, the river returned to its patient whisper, full from its feast but never finished with its hunger. Clara Bellamy was not like her sisters, where Elise had been gentle and dreamy, and Margaret quiet as a lamb. Clara's eyes were sharp as glass. From childhood she questioned the silences in her home, the unanswered prayers, the way servants crossed themselves when the river rose. She listened closely when old Caleb muttered warnings, when townsfolk whispered that every daughter was already promised. Unlike the others, she did not look away. By 16, Clara had begun keeping journals, small books she hid beneath loose floorboards in her chamber. In them she wrote what the family never dared to speak aloud. She listed names Elise, Margaret, and beside them she wrote words the others feared: taken, given, sacrificed. She recorded the strange rituals she glimpsed from shadows. Her father at the river's edge, her mother burning ribbons in the hearth. She wrote that the portraits in the quiet room were not memorials but markers, tallying a debt that could never be paid in full. Clara asked questions in her pages no one else dared. Why must daughters pay for a bargain struck by men long dead? Why should the river be master, and the Bellamys its servants? She wrote that silence was not safety but surrender. And she vowed, in ink and blood, that she would not go like her sisters had gone. Her journals became her refuge. At night, when the house creaked and the wind carried the smell of water through her window, she wrote by candlelight until her hand cramped. She detailed her father's smile, the way it stretched wider when townsfolk praised him, the rot Caleb had spoken of beneath it. She recorded how the family ate in silence at long tables, as though every meal was a funeral feast. She wrote that the river might hunger, but she would not feed it willingly. Clara also began to prepare. She practiced slipping out unseen, walking to town under moonlight with her skirts tucked up, learning the paths the overseers never watched. She befriended a washerwoman who promised to smuggle a letter if Clara ever needed. She kept a small pouch of coins hidden beneath her mattress, each one stolen from her father's study. Though fear pressed heavy on her shoulders, Clara carried within her a fire none could quench. She would not be a painted face hung on a wall, nor a body the river swallowed without a word. She was determined that when her time came, it would not be in silence, it would be in defiance. And so, while the rest of the Bellamy house pretended the river's claim was unshakable, Clara began to dream of breaking it. Not just for herself, but for every daughter yet to be born. The Bellamy mansion glittered that autumn night, its grand halls dressed in velvet and lantern light, its doors thrown open to the parish for the annual masquerade. Guests arrived in gilded masks and feathered finery, their laughter spilling out onto the veranda, their footsteps echoing across polished floors. The music of violins and harpsichord carried through the house, a tune meant to dazzle, to distract, to bury unease beneath silken gloves and wine. Judge Silas, proud in his black mask trimmed with gold, welcomed each guest as if the flood of the past summer had not swept away their neighbors' homes. His daughters were dressed in gowns of pale silk, like specters gliding among the living. Yet Clara, though she played her part with a smile and a curtsy, carried a different purpose that night. While the others twirled across the floor and the chandelier's light refracted in crystal glasses, Clara slipped away. She climbed the narrow servants' stairs, her mask tucked into her bodice, her slippered feet careful not to creak against the wood. The attic lay above the house like a forgotten heart, filled with dust, old trunks, and shadows thick as curtains. There, by the glow of a single candle, Clara found the truth her journals had only guessed. In a locked chest, beneath yellowed linens and faded ledgers, she discovered a bundle of parchment bound in red thread. The seal was wax, but when she broke it, the stain beneath was not wax at all. It was blood. She spread the papers before her trembling hands. Names filled the pages, written in her father's hand, each one marked with a date. Elise Bellamy, Margaret Bellamy. Names of cousins long gone, of aunts she had never met. Each written as though inventory, each one signed beneath by Silas himself. And beside the signatures, a symbol, a crude drawing of waves, the river itself inked as witness. The contracts told of a bargain struck generations past, renewed with every daughter, sealed in flesh and silence. The Bellamy fortune, the lands spared by flood, the walls untouched by fire, all of it promised by a covenant of blood. Every girl born was counted, weighed, and in time, offered. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her suspicions were no longer whispers on a page. They were written proof, binding and undeniable. She pressed the papers back into the chest, her heart pounding like the violins far below. As the ball below roared with music and masked laughter, Clara stood alone in the attic, the weight of centuries pressing on her shoulders. She knew then that she was no longer only resisting. She was preparing for war. At night, when the grand house settled into silence and the chandeliers dimmed to embers, another music rose from the far edge of the fields. It came from the quarters, where the enslaved gathered after days bent in cane and cotton, their bodies aching but their voices unbroken. They sang softly at first, low hums that threaded through the dark like prayers. Then the rhythm deepened, and the words carried, weaving sorrow with warning, grief with prophecy. The songs were never sung in the presence of Judge Silas, nor in the hearing of his household. To the master's ear they were but field chants, simple tunes to lighten the burden of toil. But to those who lived beneath the weight of the lash and the shadow of the river, the songs were scripture. Each verse held meaning, a code passed from parent to child, from elder to youth. In those words they named the truth that the Bellamys tried to bury beneath marble floors and lace curtains. They sang of the river, not as water alone, but as a devourer, a beast that chose its prey and marked its covenant with silence. They sang that the Bellamy daughters were not the only offerings, that the wealth of the plantation was watered not just by rain but by blood. Every field of cane cut by hands that did not own them, every brick lifted for a house that was not theirs. These, too, were sacrifices, feeding not just the river but an empire built on stolen lives. One song told of Elise and Margaret, though their names were cloaked in metaphor. The first bird who flew too close to the water, the second flower bound before it could bloom. In their voices, these tales became warnings, not only of the Bellamy curse, but of the truth that bondage itself was a river, endless and hungry. Old Caleb often led the singing, his voice raspy but steady. He wove scripture into the verses, reminding them that Egypt had fallen, that Pharaoh's house had cracked, that rivers could part when faith was strong enough. The younger ones listened with wide eyes, their bare feet tapping to the rhythm, learning that every melody carried more than sorrow, it carried memory, and memory was resistance. The Bellamys believed themselves cursed alone, but in the quarters it was understood differently. The curse was not a single family's burden. It was the shape of empire itself, a bargain struck not only by Silas with the river but by every master who fed his wealth with human lives. The daughters were taken, yes, but so were sons and mothers, fathers and kin, scattered by sale, consumed by the same hunger that kept the grand house standing tall. The song said what could not be spoken aloud, that the Bellamys thought they controlled the pact, but they were only one part of a chain that stretched across oceans. And just as rivers could rise and swallow fields, so too could the weight of suffering swell until it overturned even the strongest house. When the singing ended, the night returned to silence, but the words lingered in every heart. They had no need of written contracts or portraits on walls. Their record was in song, and song could not be locked away. In the quarters, voices rose like a hidden tide, carrying the knowledge that one day the river's appetite would turn, and when it did, it would not only take daughters, it would take empires. The night was moonless, the kind of dark that swallowed the land whole, leaving only sound to guide the living. The crickets sang in the cane, the wind rustled low through the cypress, and the Mississippi moved with its endless secret murmur. In the Bellamy house, the windows glowed faintly with candlelight, but Clara's eyes were fixed on a single flame moving beyond the fields. Her father carried a lantern. Judge Silas Bellamy walked with measured steps, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the wet earth. Clara followed at a distance, her slippers damp with dew, her breath caught tight in her chest. She had watched him vanish into the night before, had heard the creak of the door and the crunch of gravel, but never had she dared to trail him. Tonight, she did. Tonight, she needed to know. The lantern swung gently in his hand, its glow bobbing like a will-o'-the-wisp as he moved closer to the river's edge. Clara crouched behind the cane, her skirts brushing the stalks, her heart drumming so hard she feared the sound would betray her. At the water's bank, Silas stopped. He set the lantern on the ground, its light casting his face in sharp relief, the smile gone, the mask of civility stripped away. He sank to his knees, not with reverence but with gravity, as if the earth itself demanded his surrender. And then he spoke. Clara strained to hear, but the words reached her clearly, carried by the stillness of the night. He was not praying. No, Our Father. No plea to saints. No name of Christ passed his lips. Instead, he recited names. Elise. Margaret. Others, Clara recognized only from whispered family tales, women long dead and gone. His voice grew low, rhythmic, like an incantation. Each name was offered like currency, spoken into the current as if the water itself were keeping ledgers. Between names, he made promises, promises of more to come, promises of obedience, promises of silence. He spoke of land spared from flood, of wealth preserved, of power held in his hand because the river had been fed. His words were bargains, struck not with heaven, but with the depths that lapped at his boots. The lantern flickered, its light catching the reeds. Clara thought, for a moment, she saw movement in the water, a ripple too large for fish, too slow for wind. The river seemed to lean closer, listening. Silas bowed his head, his shoulders shaking, not with grief but with fervor. Clara realized then that her father was not master of the bargain. He was its servant. He did not command the river. He obeyed it. A chill spread through her bones, sharper than the night air. This was no curse passed down against his will. This was devotion, a pact renewed willingly, eagerly, by the man who should have been her protector. Clara stepped back into the shadows, her hands trembling. She had seen enough. She had seen too much. The lantern on the water's edge flickered once more, casting its glow across the restless current. Behind her, the Bellamy mansion loomed silent. But in Clara's heart, the silence was broken forever. She knew now that her father's power did not rest in law or land. It rested in the river, and one day it would demand her name too unless she found a way to end it. The morning came heavy with heat, the kind that pressed against the skin before the sun had even risen high. Clara sat at the parlor window, her journal hidden beneath her skirts, when she saw a figure approaching the house. It was not one of the neighbors, nor a trader, nor the overseer's kin. This woman moved with purpose, her stride long, her dress travel-worn, her hair wrapped in bright cloth that caught the light like a banner. By the time she reached the front steps, her presence was impossible to ignore. Servants paused in their work, whispering, their eyes flicking between her and the great house. Clara's mother frowned, her lips tight, but it was Clara who felt a strange pull, as though the air itself had shifted. The stranger introduced herself with a voice that carried both French lilt and river weight. She said her name was Celeste. She said she was kin. The claim unsettled the parlor. Judge Bellamy demanded proof, but Celeste only smiled, her eyes sharp, as if she knew more than she would ever need to say. She carried no papers, no letters, no fine family seals. She carried only her knowledge of the Bellamy line, names spoken in the old tongue, names buried deeper than the parish records. Clara felt her father stiffen. For the first time, she saw him falter. Celeste turned to Clara, and her gaze lingered. "The river remembers your face," she said softly, as though the words were meant for no one else. "It has been waiting." That night, Clara found her in the garden, away from the ears of her parents. Celeste stood among the magnolias, the white blooms glowing faint against the dark. She spoke without preamble, her tone grave. "You think the river is only water," she said, "but it is covenant. Older than the parish, older than the Bellamy name. Your bloodline made its promise, and promises cannot be buried. Every daughter born under that roof is marked. Every daughter is an offering." Clara's chest tightened, anger warring with fear. "If you know so much, then tell me why. Why us? Why this curse?" Celeste's eyes softened, though her voice carried no mercy. Because your family chose power. They chose to be spared when others drowned. They chose to have their fields spared when others starved. They made the river their altar, and now it does not ask, it takes. The cicadas screamed in the trees, filling the silence between them. Clara thought of her father kneeling by the water, thought of the names whispered like prayers. She thought of the daughters who had vanished, their faces erased but never forgotten. Celeste stepped closer, her presence both warning and comfort. You must be the one to end it, child. But the river will not let go without a fight. It has already tasted your name. It will come for you soon. Clara's hands shook, her voice barely rising above a whisper. And if I resist? Celeste looked past her, toward the dark line of the Mississippi that curved beyond the cane. Then the river will rise, and it will feast until it is satisfied. Clara felt the weight of those words settle in her bones. The stranger had come not with salvation, but with truth, and truth was heavier than chains. She knew then that her time was running short. The river was waiting, and it had already chosen her. The house smelled of starch and muslin. Seamstresses moved about with pins between their lips, measuring, hemming, whispering as if their work were holy. A new gown had been prepared for Clara, the same white muslin that her sisters had worn before their disappearances, as spotless as bridal cloth and just as binding. The dress hung in her room like a ghost waiting to be worn. Clara stared at it, her jaw tight, her fists clenched. She would not put it on. She would not step willingly into the role her father had written for her. The muslin, the bows, the ceremony. These were not tradition, they were shackles, and she was done pretending otherwise. When her mother came to coax her, Clara turned away. Tell him I will not wear it, she said flatly. Her mother's face drained of color, her lips trembling as if she wanted to plead, but Clara's eyes burned with such fire that no words could pass. That night, Clara lit a candle in her room and opened her journal. Her handwriting cut hard into the page, the nib scratching like a blade. She wrote of Elise, of Margaret, of the river that swallowed them whole. She wrote of her father's bargains, of Celeste's warning, of the silence that had ruled the house for too long. Each word was a weapon, each sentence a rebellion. She would leave behind a record no one could burn away. But words alone would not save her. She needed a plan. She needed the courage to turn her defiance into action. The gown stood in the corner like a sentinel, reminding her that time was thin, that the river's hunger was patient, but certain. Clara slipped into the corridors of the house and listened. She heard her father's voice in the study, low and steady, as if reciting scripture. But the words were names, always names, spoken to something no one else could see. She pressed her ear to the door and caught the sound of the river outside, answering with its restless current. Her blood chilled, but her resolve hardened. She decided then that if the river demanded the Bellamys, then she would give it the one who had called it forth. She would give it Judge Silas. The following days she moved in silence, observing, learning. She discovered the hidden keys her father kept for the riverbank chest, the one that held contracts sealed in his own hand. She watched where he placed his lantern each midnight, how he knelt and whispered bargains into the water. She memorized the rhythm of his steps, the ritual of his curse. Meanwhile, the gown remained untouched. Servants grew anxious, whispering that the youngest Bellamy daughter had turned wild, that her refusal was dangerous. Clara let them whisper. She had chosen her path. One evening, standing before her mirror, she lifted the gown and draped it across the chair. "This is not my shroud," she whispered. "This house will not bury me." Instead, she bound her hair back tight and took up the lantern herself. In the reflection, she did not see a girl in need of saving. She saw a daughter-turned weapon, a flame meant to consume the rot that had poisoned her bloodline. The river had taken too much. If it demanded another Bellamy life, then let it come for the patriarch who fed it. Clara would face the covenant with steel in her voice and fire in her hands, even if it meant tearing the plantation down to its foundations. For the first time, she did not feel afraid. She felt ready. The night came heavy with thunder. The sky above the plantation split open with lightning, casting white scars across the black horizon. Rain fell in sheets, soaking the fields until the soil churned like quicksand. The Mississippi swelled and roared, its current swollen with rage, its voice louder than any sermon or gavel. This was no ordinary storm. It was the river itself, rising to collect what it was owed. Inside the house, the servants whispered, and the daughters trembled. Clara stood unyielding, her muslin gown untouched, folded neatly upon her bed, like the corpse of a tradition. She had told herself she would not go, and now the river itself seemed to agree. She could feel it calling through the walls, shaking the windows, rattling the bones of the plantation. The Mississippi no longer wanted her, it wanted him. Judge Silas Bellamy stood at the doorway, his frame outlined by the glow of a lantern. His smile was steady, but his eyes betrayed unease. For years, he had commanded the court, had commanded his family, had commanded the very river with whispered bargains. But tonight, his commands rang hollow. Tonight, the river would not be tamed. "Clara," he said, his voice loud over the storm, "you will come." Heaven. She did not move. She simply lifted her chin. "No, not me. Not anymore." The defiance in her voice cut sharper than the storm. For a moment, he faltered. Then the ground itself seemed to groan. And the house trembled. Windows shattered as water pressed near, rising past the cane fields, rushing through the orchards. The Mississippi had left its bed. It was coming for its due. Silas grabbed the lantern and strode into the rain. Clara followed, not in submission but in witness. She needed to see it with her own eyes, to know that the curse could be broken. Servants crowded the porch, clutching one another, praying aloud in voices ragged with fear. The storm lit the plantation in brief, violent flashes, the columns gleaming white, the magnolias bending low, the swollen river surging like a living thing. At the water's edge, Silas raised his arms. His robe clung to his body, his lantern shook in the wind. "I have given you what you asked," he shouted into the storm. "Daughters for safety, blood for prosperity. I have honored my end. Spare this house." But the river did not answer with mercy. A wave rose higher than the judge himself, black water crowned with foam. It crashed against the bank, tearing the lantern from his grip. The flame hissed out, leaving only darkness. The water surged forward, wrapping around him like grasping hands. He staggered, tried to pull free, but the current had already claimed him. Clara stood frozen as the Mississippi pulled her father down. His cry was brief, cut off as he vanished beneath the surface. The current swallowed him whole, dragging him out into its endless body. The river had taken its due, not the daughter but the judge, not the innocent but the guilty. The storm began to ease. The thunder moved farther off. The swollen banks slowly stilled, as though satisfied. Clara's hair clung to her face, her dress heavy with rain, but she felt light, as if chains had been broken. Behind her, the house loomed, battered but still standing. Inside, portraits of lost daughters hung silent on the walls. Tonight, their painted eyes would rest easier. The pact had shifted, and the river had chosen justice at last. Clara turned from the water. She did not weep. She did not tremble. She only whispered into the night, "It's over." And for the first time in generations, the Bellamy Plantation no longer belonged to the river. Morning crept slowly across the broken land. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in every flooded furrow, in every toppled tree, in every cane stalk flattened by the river's fury. The Bellamy Plantation stood battered and bruised, its columns streaked with mud, its gardens half drowned, its fields a shallow sea of brown water. The house itself had survived, but it no longer carried the air of power. It sagged in exhaustion, like a body too long bent beneath a curse. The servants moved quietly through the wreckage, gathering what they could, their voices hushed, as if afraid the river might hear. The daughters clung to one another, their pale gowns soiled and sodden, their eyes wide with questions none dared to voice. They searched the faces around them for the judge, but Judge Silas Bellamy was gone. The Mississippi had taken him in the night, and it had not returned his body. No coffin would be carved, no grave dug. The river had claimed him fully, as it had claimed the daughters before, but this time the covenant was broken. Clara stood on the veranda, her gaze fixed on the swollen banks. The Mississippi had receded slightly, its rage stilled, its voice softened into silence. Yet its presence was undeniable. It watched with the patience of a predator, as though reminding her that freedom came not with erasure, but with vigilance. She breathed the wet air deeply, the scent of mud and magnolia mingling into something sharp and unforgettable. Inside the house, she sat at her writing desk and opened the journal where so many of her thoughts, her fears, her defiance had been poured out in secret. The pages were swollen from damp air, but they still held. With ink that trembled only slightly in her hand, Clara wrote the final entry. She wrote that Elise and Margaret had not been accidents, nor sacrifices of fate, but daughters stolen by a bargain never meant to endure. She wrote that the Bellamy curse was not the river itself, but the silence that allowed it to reign unchecked. She wrote that her father's ambition had poisoned his bloodline, binding innocence to water in exchange for wealth and dominion. But she also wrote that the chain had been broken. Her words flowed steady, each sentence a stone laid to mark the end of an old path and the beginning of another. She declared that the Bellamy daughters were free, not because the river's hunger was gone, but because someone had dared to refuse it. Freedom, she knew, was fragile. It would require courage each day, as the current would always watch from the edge of the fields. Still, for the first time, courage felt possible. When she set down the pen, she closed the book gently. It was no longer a private journal. It was a record, a testimony, a witness to the truth that could not be buried with mud or drowned in floods. She placed it upon the mantel, where no one in the house could ignore it. Outside, the sun broke weakly through the clouds, casting a pale light upon the water. The Mississippi glistened, its surface deceptively calm, as if nothing had happened at all. Clara stepped outside once more, her feet sinking into the soft earth, and stared at the river that had defined her life. She did not thank it. She did not curse it. She only acknowledged it, a force that would remain long after the house crumbled, long after her name was forgotten. The river was silence now, but silence was not peace. Clara turned back toward the house, her shoulders squared. The Bellamy daughters were free, but she knew the river was still watching.